Alright guys, SP Tendo will be the next character coming up, so let's go through his skills once again and talk about whether or not you should be summoning for him. So starting off with his skill 1, he is going to use his awareness for critical performance actions for defensive actions. So in case you guys don't know, normally for defensive actions such as block, you tend to use reflex to calculate the probability of whether or not you will be doing a critical block. However, in the case for Tendo, he will actually be using awareness instead for the calculation. Now you might be thinking, in that case, what is actually going to be his reflex stats doing? Now his reflex stats will actually be decreased down to 0, and for every 1% reflex reduced this way, he will be getting a spirit buff instead. Now this is quite interesting in a couple of different things. Okay, so first of all, he will be using awareness for critical performance. So that normally means is that normally for a lot of very pure defensive action characters, you might be thinking slot 2 main stat is normally not that useful because you don't really care about any of those offensive stats. However, in the case of Tendo, basically you will be actually able to find some meaningfulness in this slot 2 main stat because you could actually use awareness, which then in turn buff up his defensive action, which is quite nice. Okay, so that's one perk for that. But then also the other thing is that you'll be reducing your reflex and converting them into spirit. This is also quite nice from potential build point of view because normally for slot 4 main stat, if you actually do the conversion, you normally can either get 20% reflex or 40% spirit. So the normal ratio between that is already 1 to 2. And basically with this, what it kind of means is that for Tendo slot 4 main stat, it doesn't really matter whether you put reflex or spirit, both of them will be converted to the same amount of spirit no matter what. And that'll give you a bit more, I guess, more choices in terms of you trying to find the optimal substat for slot 4 potential. So that's also quite nice. However, one thing you do have to bear in mind with this conversion is that it's only going to happen at the start of match. So for example, if you are actually going to get any reflex buff in the middle of the match, for example from Kenma, etc., then those won't be used at all because it won't be used for defensive critical calculation, nor would it be converted into spirit. So that is something you do have to bear in mind. Basically, Tendo doesn't play well with any reflex buff that only happen in the middle of the match. Next up, we are going to have his skill 2. This is a quick spike. So he does actually have this quick spiking label from speciality point of view if you do actually want to fit in a quick spiking team. Now, this one, I'm going to be honest, you are not really going to use Tendo for quick spiking, so it doesn't really matter. This one does say that, for example, the base is 140. If the power is actually going to be greater than 200, then this will increase by an extra 20%. And basically, one of the easiest way of getting 140 to over 200 is basically performing critical action, because a critical action, even the base level is going to be 50% extra, so that already takes your 140 multiplier to 210, and therefore you're already able to trigger this. And considering you should be getting a lot of awareness in order to guarantee his defensive action, this, to be honest, can actually be triggered vast majority of the time. But once again, you're not really going to use Tendo or build him in a way where he is going to have very high quick spiking stats, so vast majority of the time you wouldn't even be using this. Okay. Okay, now let's actually quickly jump to skill 4 before then going back to skill 3. You'll see the reason in a bit. But basically for his skill 4, it's an ultimate block. It's only 240% multiplier at the lowest level, but it can go all the way up to 300. So that's kind of in line with lots of other ultimate blocks. But the most unique thing about this is actually normally it's 0 net crossing. However, every single time you use it, the power is going to increase. But at the same time, the maximum cooldown is also going to increase. Now this is actually quite interesting because if you actually compare him to lots of other mid blockers, what you realize is that the ultimate cooldown is normally 12 net crossing. And what that basically means is that Tendo can actually get to his first 7 ultimate a lot quicker, because it's only after 7 ultimate usage, this would then be increased to 12 net crossing, which is then in line with other characters. And let's be honest, normally because your mid blocker can only stay on the front row for 3 rotations, it's actually going to be quite difficult for you to find any mid blocker which can cost more than 7 ultimate blocks in one match. So vast majority of the time, even though this will exponentially grow larger, however, vast majority of the time he would actually tend to cast his ultimate a lot more often in comparison to lots of other mid blockers. So overall, it's still a fairly positive thing. Okay. But now let's talk about his skill tree. This is where it kind of gets a bit interesting. So at the start of match, his awareness is going to increase by 50%, and that's actually going to be quite nice because remember, he actually uses his awareness for his defensive crit probability. Now, however, whenever he make a critical play, his awareness is actually going to decrease by 10%. And in return, the block stats is also going to increase, but let's be honest, you are reducing awareness by 10% only for mere increase of block by 3%. It's not really something ideal. Now, what is actually going to be the impact of this, however? Now, this is another reason why Tendo really shouldn't be using his quick spiking at all, because this says when he makes a critical play, it doesn't say critical block. So basically, if you actually make him to do a critical, let's say, serve or a critical quick spike, then this will actually accelerate your awareness reduction, which you don't really want, okay? And now, if we actually talk this in the context of him only performing blocks, what this is going to mean is that if you actually perform 4 blocks, all of the awareness you'll be getting is going to be completely reduced. And in fact, I just realized this can actually be stacked up to 6 times. Even though your awareness only increased by 50, your awareness reduction can actually go all the way down to by minus 60%, which is also quite annoying. However, what we just talked about is that his ultimate is actually going to be capable of spamming very, very early on. And what that basically means is that for the very first time you use it, you're already going to get minus 10. However, because you're then able to spam his ultimate block straight away, you are going to get another minus 10 due to this. And then even though net crossing is increased up to 2, if you actually think about it, when the ball goes to the enemy's field and then come back, that's already 2 net crossing by itself. So essentially what Tendo can normally do is actually perform 3 ultimate blocks in a row without any breaks, because even by the time of the 3rd ultimate, it's just going to be 2 net crossing and he will still be capable of doing that. And what that basically means is that straight off the bat, your Tendo is actually going to be at minus 30% awareness. So even though this is a very, very high boost up front, on paper, this would actually go down very, very fast. And then as a result, you need to really have other ways of using basically get some awareness buff on Tendo in order to guarantee him can do all of those defensive crit, because do not expect the 50% to last very long time. This will run down really, really fast due to the fact that he can actually spam his ultimate block. Okay, now when Tendo actually makes a critical play, the power is also going to increase by whatever, but I'm just going to make it simple. You're not going to use him for critical spot, so let's just take this to be block. Okay, so basically when you make a critical block, your power is going to increase by another 65%. So that's normally if this is only going to be 240, now it's going to be 305. And then the other thing is that when you're not making a critical play, the power will actually decrease by 85. So that's normally it's 240. What's going to happen now is actually only going to be 100 and how much are we reducing? 85. So it's now only going to be 155. Okay, and now you can already see a big difference. When it's critical, not only you get the extra buff from the the multiplier because it is a crit, also the skill multiplier for his block is going to be 305, and when it's not an ultimate, it's only going to be 155. So it's almost double in terms of the strength just from the skill multiplier, and then adding on the fact that a critical block is normally 50% higher in power naturally, just based on your strength stats, etc. So the difference between when Tendo is actually able to do a critical block versus non-critical block is going to be really, really different. And that's kind of why you have to bear in mind, because Tendo's skill 3, yes, he will be getting a huge buff in his awareness. On paper, he will be running that really, really quickly. You have to have someone on your team who's capable of actually buffing up his awareness, okay? Now, then the next thing for this is that when he casts his ultimate, so when anyone on your team casts ultimate, that player is going to get a stack or multiplicative effect. And when that is equal to 2, basically when the same player casts 2 ultimate, what's going to happen is be removing that and also increase attack and defense technique by 15%, lasting for 2 turns, and also you're able to increase morale as well. Now, this is quite interesting. First of all, increasing morale this is actually a fairly consistent way of increasing morale. It's not like the biggest way of increasing morale. However, if you are focusing on a team which is very heavy focused on trying to get as much morale as possible, then this is actually one of the, not the top player in order to contribute to morale, but definitely one of the top 3, top 4, someone you would probably want to consider. So this is already quite interesting by itself. And then on top of that, also increasing your attack and defense technique, and this for the last for 2 turns, well, it's also very, very interesting. Now I'm not sure whether or not this can actually stack, however, so that may be something to be tested. But even if it can't be stacked, the fact that it lasts for 2 turns, and vast majority of the time, I reckon a lot of characters should be able to use, let's say, 1 ultimate every rally. So the fact that it's able to last for 2 turns, and also basically takes 2 ultimate for this to activate, normally should mean this is somewhat permanent from the second rally onwards. Okay, so this is also quite interesting here. Now moving on to his skill resonance. Resonance 2, awareness now is going to further increase. This is actually quite nice because I already said awareness is going to run down very, very fast. So unless you have other ways of also really quickly buffing up your awareness, but even let's say if you play SP or Kawa, who's one of the best awareness buffer in the game, he actually takes some time to give that huge amount of awareness. So every bit of awareness is going to help. And then the other thing is that his spirit is also going to further increase by 60% of strength up to 60%. Now this one, personally, I'm going to struggle to think how Tendo is actually going to get 100% strength in order to completely max stack this, because the vast majority of the time your slot 2 main side, you probably want to focus on awareness rather than strength. However, let's say if you if you actually end up having a strength buffer on your team, then obviously that could also be converted to extra spirit buff for Tendo as well. So it's definitely not a bad thing, but it's not really mandatory. And then Resonance 4, when he's on the core, whenever someone uses ultimate, you're also going to increase the permanent stats up to 20 times, and this lasts for the whole match. So in theory, you can actually get 20% buff to the base stat for your entire team. So this is quite nice, but obviously it takes time for this to actually stack up. And then the other thing is that when he actually leaves the court, whoever subs in is going to increase defense technique and also guarantee not to lose any points for the first receive. This can be quite handy if you actually set Tendo to be subbed out as a liberal substitution, etc. But once again, I don't feel like anything in Resonance 4 is kind of like a must-have or game changer. So to be honest, personally, I don't feel like you need any Resonance at all for Tendo. Now, what also makes Tendo quite interesting is actually going to be his bond, because he does have one with Ushijima, however, it's a fairly average bond in my opinion. First of all, there's a condition, which is the fact that Ushijima need to receive a debuff, and even once you meet that condition, all you're going to get is the increase of block by just maximum 12%. I don't really care about quick attack because you're not going to use Tendo to quick attack anyway. And then the other thing is that when you perform critical block, which would actually happen, now you're also able to increase Ushijima's spike power. I'm not sure whether or not this actually stacks, because considering the fact that Tendo can potentially actually spam his ultimate block in the same rally. But once again, he only lost for one rally, so even though this okay-ish buff, none of them is like a game changer, so you don't have to play them together. Okay, and then the other thing is gonna be this bond with Mia twins. This one's also quite interesting. It doesn't actually buff Tendo that much. I almost would say it's a bit of a double-edged sword for Tendo, because you'll be reducing your awareness down to 0. However, you're also going to get defense technique in return, and also your first touch of each rally is also guaranteed to be critical as well. However, the thing with Tendo is that Tendo is actually capable of spamming blocks. So what that basically means is that if your rally actually lasts for more than 2 blocks, then what's actually going to happen is that your Tendo's awareness is going to drop down to 0, and therefore you have absolutely 0 ways of guaranteeing your defensive block to be critical anymore for the rest of that rally. So to me, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. What this bond is actually more useful is actually to buff up your Mia twins instead, because you'll be buffing up both your strengths for both of the Mia twins, and also for each winter break character, which in this case all 3 of them are. You're also going to further increase attack and defense technique, and those are some really, really buff to get as well. So to me, this doesn't actually buff up Tendo himself that much, but it's a quite good bond for the team as a whole. Okay, so now let's wrap it up. Should they actually summon for SP Tendo? Personally, I think SP Tendo himself is not actually that bad, in the sense that he is actually able to, for example, perform very strong critical blocks, and then also he is actually potentially able to spam it, even though this cooldown will increase. But the fact that if you consider how often a mid blocker actually stays in the front row to actually perform blocks, this more or less even out to other mid blockers. So overall, I definitely don't think he's a bad character. However, one thing I would say say is that even though he has lots of synergy with other characters, he's never a must-have in any kind of team composition. Because yes, whilst he is able to boost morale, there are also other characters who are capable of boosting morale. Yes, he does have this bond with Yushi Gmail, however, it's not really that needed. And whilst other culture festival trio are also going to benefit him, for example, the huge awareness buff from SP Okawa is obviously going to be beneficial for Tendo, because Tendo can then use that awareness for critical performance, etc. However, if you use a different mid blocker, all of the other mid blocker tend to have ways of performing critical blocks anyway in their kit, so you don't really need to have that. And then in terms of this winter trio bond, once again, it's a really nice bond and a good buff for the Mia twins and also the rest of the team, but you don't really need Tendo for that. And if you actually look at the rest of Tendo's kit, Tendo doesn't actually give too much supporting buff in his kit other than this section here. And if all you need for Tendo in this winter trio bond is the fact that to give extra buff for strength, etc., why don't you just play another dedicated buffer for that role instead, right? So Tendo is just a bit of a weird character in my opinion. Like, I can see his usefulness in quite a few team composition, like in both Culture Festival Trio, in Winter Break Trio with Mia Twins, and also in Team Morale Boosting Trio. However, at the same time, for all three of those team composition, he's more of a borderline character. He's not going to be one of the main core members. So if you're already on limited resources, for example, you're budgeting for future SP Hiragami and SP Koroi, then Tendo is definitely one of those choices which you can safely skip, because even if you skip that, there are going to be other alternatives. Regardless which team composition you want to use, there can be other alternatives that you want to place instead. So you're definitely not missing out on Tendo. However, at the same time, if you do really want to get Tendo, I do feel like he's somewhat cheap character to get. His resonance skills are not really that important, so if you can just get one copy and be done with it, I personally feel like that can also be fairly efficient, especially the fact that he is able to give some kind of added synergy to quite a few different team combos as well. So to me, that's kind of why he's a bit of an interesting character, in the sense that he is a bit of a supporting edge, but it's not really good enough for you to spend the resources on. Okay, so that's going to be my take on SP Tendo. But let me know what you guys think, and also, are you going to summon for him?